This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Education. I think that's important. I think we do have to educate not just the men in our lives, but also the judges and the lawyers to better understand what coercive control is. So I'm going to refer to the importance of this on behalf of the children, because they end up being the victims as well as the mothers in all of this. So I'm going to take you to an event that occurred on Christmas Day, December 2017. Chloe and Aubrey Berry, ages 6 and 4, were found by police in a ground floor apartment in Oak Bay. They were murdered by their father. The mother, if you read through the court case, the mother was continually trying to advise the courts, and nobody listened. What advice would you provide to the courts today? And this is just one of many cases that occur. How can we change that to criminalize the father because we're not protecting our children?
Thank you very much for that question. Yes, so the Berry case is a very disturbing one, and sadly one of only many cases where children have been killed by abusive fathers. And something that we found in the Divorce Act research that I mentioned is that even though the Divorce Act now requires children's exposure to family violence to be taken into account when making parenting orders, it seems that courts are still really struggling with understanding what that means. And so in many cases, what they look for is that children have been directly exposed to violence, rather than also considering how children's indirect exposure to violence can have a very adverse impact on them. And so what we see is that it's very rare for things like supervised parenting orders to be made by the courts. And even if it is a case where criminal charges are laid, eventually if a person is incarcerated, they get out of jail. And so I guess what I'm encouraging the committee to do is to think not only about the criminal side of things, but to also think about the family law side of coercive control and the need for courts and legal professionals to be educated so they understand the impact on children and the need sometimes for parenting orders to be supervised to try to prevent these types of killings in the future.
But if we don't incarcerate them and have them go through treatments while they're incarcerated, how do we protect the children is what confuses me, because if they pay for their crimes and if we educate them and work with them, hopefully they'll come out and be better people. Do you agree?
Well, I think training and counseling and those types of things can also occur without incarceration. And so in Alberta, where I'm from, our domestic violence courts use peace bonds quite regularly, which means that people are not incarcerated, but if they admit responsibility for the offense, they're still sent to treatment. There's mixed evidence, though, on whether that type of treatment works. And so again, what I'm encouraging is that criminal law be looked at alongside what happens in the family law realm, so that we can be thinking about how these two systems work together, and the fact that sometimes we need to have protections in the family law sphere, even if there has been treatment and or incarceration in the criminal sphere.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask Louise the same question, if you wouldn't mind. I mean, we could look at many cases. We could look at Kara's Law, which is the same situation. The father was very controlling. The child was ignored. The mother was ignored. And we had another tragedy. We have to ensure that we protect the victims. How can we do that if we don't control the men that are, doing the crime?
You're quite right when you say that there's a big challenge when it comes to family law as well. Every day we see that often lawyers, or rather judges, think that violence is towards the women, but there's no violence towards children if it's not direct. And incorrectly, we think that violence stops when their couple separates, but in fact, often that's when it becomes most dangerous, when there's a separation. So there needs to be a dialogue between the criminal law side of things and the family law side. And family law has to recognize that the presence of domestic violence is dangerous for the women and children, and measures need to be implemented. Often we talk about shared custody. That's a situation that obliges the parents to often remain in contact one with the other because of the link with children. That multiplies opportunities for controlling spouses to exert violence towards their ex-partner or the children.
Okay, so I would also like to ask Karina the same question, because there was another incident in the mid-90s where a father was supposed to have supervised visitations with his children. He then, in turn, and the reason they separated was because he was very controlling. Not only did they lacked the supervision, he ended up killing his 4 children, shooting himself, and before doing that, burning up the house. So again, he went through some kind of treatment, but obviously it didn't work. How do we protect, as society, protect our children?
Anna, unfortunately, your time has been exhausted, so perhaps she can incorporate her answer into somebody else's. Okay, thank you.
I wondered if we could maybe talk a little bit about parental alienation, because one of the things that came up in my meetings are reunification camps, and how these are much like coercive control, much like conversion therapy, being used to send young children to the United States to camps at tens of thousands of dollars of cost to the mums, to basically convert them to reunite with an abusive partner. So I wonder, do you have any comments on that, on whether or not you think the federal government should do something, whether legislatively or through regulations, about these reunification camps?
Thank you very much for that question. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, I think our research on family law very much supports the recommendations that have been made by the National Association of Women in the Law about the need to limit parental alienation arguments in family law cases, because often they are raised in response to allegations of family violence by women. And you're absolutely right that we sometimes do see judges buying into this notion of parental alienation, when really what a mother is trying to do is protect her children from abuse. And then in cases that are considered extreme, these reunification camps occur, which are extremely harmful to children. And so, yes, I would urge the committee to think about placing limits both on the extent to which these types of arguments can be made in family law proceedings, but also the types of remedies that can be ordered. And I believe there really do need to be limits placed on these types of reunification so-called therapies.
The one thing that the mums and children that have been subjected to these camps said that if the reunification therapy and reunification camps were ended, it would stop the money train, and it would actually help in judges not recommending. And I don't know. I know I'm directing my questions at you, Professor Koshin, because you brought it up. But if Leaf or anyone else wants to jump in, you're more than welcome to.
Maybe I'll just briefly make a plug for Lyndon Nielsen's research in this area, because she found that sometimes the people who are testifying as experts in parental alienation cases are the same people who run the reunification camps, and they stand to profit directly from those camps.
I'll go over to you in just one second, but these camps are tens of thousands of dollars, and the charge for them is being charged to the mums, who often have to mortgage a house, or we're not talking about small amounts of money that are being the cost to try and fix these kids, and talking to these young people who've been subjected to these camps or therapy, it's absolutely horrible. You wanted to add to that?
Yes. over and above banning these camps, work has to be done to educate the courts and the psycho-legal experts. When a woman is trying to protect their children, when a child says that they don't want to see their father because they've experienced violence or observed violence, we need to listen to the child. We're starting to now talk about judicial-based violence. That's one way that the spouse actually exploits things to continue to control their partner. So we completely agree with these recommendations from the National Women and Law Association to actually ban the use of parental alienation. It's a concept which is not scientifically based. Unfortunately, it's been adopted by too many family and youth courts, and we think this is simply a way of maintaining the status quo and maintaining the power of fathers who are controlling and violent.
I think there's two issues, though. One is the null recommendation about banning parental alienation in the law, but then there's also getting rid of the reunification therapy. Would you agree with that? The actual therapy in camps? You're shaking your head. Yes. Okay. One of the issues we have with mandatory training, though, is, and this committee studied Keir's law, thanks to MP Dillon, and I worked on that. We can't mandate training for judges, and I'm very grateful that the province of Ontario has implemented Keir's law, as has Manitoba. I would encourage Quebec to do the same, but we're really limited as legislators in requiring training for judges, and a lot of the people who need training actually fall within provincial jurisdictions, so children's aid societies and crown prosecutors, and I think we've come a long way thanks to MP Dillon's private members bill and the work of Jennifer Kagan, but we are limited in as educators on training, and I think I have about 15 seconds left, so I'll end it there. Thank you.
Would you also agree to not criminalize coercive control?
Yes, we do agree with that. And we also submitted a brief to the Just Committee, which outlines more in depth our submissions.
Okay, I have another question for you. One of the things that I've put forward, you were talking about, let's instead focus on prevention, or, ways so that people exiting violence can actually do that. One of the things that I put forward that will be voted on in the fall is to put in place a guaranteed livable basic income. Do you agree that we need a guaranteed livable basic income as one ways to deal with the gender-based violence crisis?
I think absolutely having a basic income, along with having affordable public services and housing and increased social protections, all of this would assist in helping survivors know that they can be safe if they need to leave their relationship.
So you agree, you would recommend a guaranteed livable basic income in addition to other supports and services meant to meet specific and special needs?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Over to you, Ms. Caution. Would you also agree?
Yes, for the exact same reasons mentioned by Ms. Parse, I agree that that's a very important way of ensuring social and economic support.
Okay, wonderful. And I don't, my apologies, I don't have the names of the other two witnesses in front of me. I'm just looking up. Would you also agree, Madame Barrett and Rideau, that a guaranteed livable basic, would you recommend putting in place a guaranteed livable basic income in addition to other supports meant to meet specific and special needs as a key action to deal with gender-based violence and people fleeing coercive control?
Absolutely. Access to decent income, access to affordable social housing that's safe, and access to different social policies are essential elements to allow women who are fleeing violence to be able to actually do this in an easier way.
Madame Caution, you spoke a lot about parental alienation. Do you believe that courts should not be able to use parental alienation as an argument in cases?
Yes, I agree with that. I have a bit of a caveat, if I have 1 second to mention that. I think there needs to be a distinction made between parental alienation allegations made against mothers and what we sometimes see from fathers, which is an actual sabotage of children's relationship with their mothers, which is itself a form of family violence. So I think we need to keep a distinction between those two different types of practices. And if we can do that, then yes, I think parental alienation arguments should not be permitted in family courts.
Ms. Parsa, Madame Parsa.
Sure. At this point, LEAF does not support a full ban on parental alienation, just because we need to do some more internal work on establishing our position on this. But we do think it is certainly extremely important for courts and judges to be educated on the ways in which litigation is used as a form of abuse. And that's actually one of the things that we're afraid of if coercive control becomes a new criminal offense, that will also be weaponized against women as a form essentially of coercive control. So we think it is crucial that courts and members of the legal system are educated and continue to learn about this.
So you recommend educating courts and others about what parental alienation is?
Absolutely.
Okay, wonderful.
Michelle, you have 5 minutes.
And thank you to our witnesses today here at Status of Women, aka FEWO, as we study coercive control. And, you know, we've seen a drastic rise in domestic violence. We've seen some wild stories that my colleague and around the table, all the women here today have shared. I guess I'll start with you, Ms. Koshin. I think it would be beneficial in this report to have a definition, because you've outlined this, between a protective mother, and I also always, for the record, want to say this does happen to men. I always want to say this can happen in anybody's, but we are focusing on women here. The difference between a protective mother versus coercive control and the definition, because I think the definition is a key part of this conversation.
Yes. And it's challenging to do in the limited time that we have, but
you are very welcome to submit a written
yes.
Because I do understand this is very big, and it's like, oh, in 10 seconds, tell us about, I understand that. So if you want to submit a written submission, we'd love to have it as well.
Yes, thank you. And maybe what I'll do, just to try and put a fine point on it, is to say coercive control, in the way that it's understood as a form of intimate partner violence or family violence, is all about the impact that it has on the autonomy of the victim. So a pattern of conduct that has an impact on the autonomy of the victim. Whereas if we think about mothers' protective conduct, they are not engaged in that conduct in order to impair the autonomy of fathers. They are trying to protect their children. So in part, it's, I think, a difference in the intent behind the conduct, what they're trying to achieve through the conduct. And I think there is a real distinction to be drawn between attempting to protect one's children and attempting to control one's partner in a way that impairs their autonomy, if I can put it.
Yeah, and I think you pointed out the challenge here in itself of the complications of this and why it is so important that judges would need to be so critically educated in this, because there's a nuance here, and anybody who has had experience in an abusive relationship, sometimes the abuse or the toxic relationship between the intimate partners is vile, but they're able to have relationships with their children, or the children need to see each parent. But the system is set up right now that the children are pawns for money, for all of these things. And where I want to go with this is this cost of living crisis that further alienates or forces women into abusive relationships. Like, you have stats now, this was a National Post article, divorce rates in Canada falling because Canadians simply can't afford it. So we already know, like, money is one of the biggest reasons you can't leave a relationship. If they're having financial control, which thank you for these great handouts, they're super helpful in educating the public in terms of the definitions. And for so many people, they don't even know they're in an unhealthy relationship because that's all they've ever known. And the children don't know. So when we want to intervene and sort of pull that apart and break that pattern, and then you have articles like this saying, The main reasons wedding bells aren't ringing seems to be the hefty price tag and the overall cost of living, or the inability to be able to afford to leave, or the access to housing. So I guess I see, the witnesses in here. I don't know who wants to chime in on that, but I'd love to see something in the report around that, because this cost of living is a very, very big factor in allowing women to break free from abusive relationships. I see Louise making eye contact, so I'll just ask Louise.
Yes, we are seeing that certain women who are asking for help from the shelters do decide to go back to their violent spouse because it's impossible for them to find affordable, safe housing that will allow them to continue to feed their children, bring them up, and clothe their children. So these are key issues. And every day we've seen that as the housing crisis increases in Quebec, women remain longer in shelters, which causes other knock-on problems. That means that other women then cannot come in to the shelters. So we absolutely have to work on the economic situation and the economic autonomy of women, give them access to jobs that will allow them to have that type of freedom. Also, to work on the fact that seeing these signs of control, sometimes spouses force women to leave their jobs or deprive them of financial resources. That's something that has to be detected as well if we want to help women.
And I think that we've skipped a little bit in this committee from, what is coercive control, right, to what can the government do, what can the justice system do, how do we educate, but we haven't actually gotten on record exactly what it is that we're talking about. And we've had witnesses here to talk about financial and economic abuse. We've had witnesses talking about, of course, physical violence against women and girls and non-binary, gender-diverse people. But what exactly is coercive control? And before you answer that, specifically right now to Madame Riendo and Madame Barrette, you did hand out something that I just glanced at and find very useful. I hope you will table that so that it becomes part of our official documents of the committee. But it talks about monitoring and interrogation, threats, sexual violence, gaslighting, financial abuse, spiritual violence, harassment, humiliation, abuse using technology, blaming, physical violence, isolation. These are things I suspect that people who know people or who have personally experienced coercive control would know instinctively, but not necessarily be able to articulate or even describe to others, particularly judges and others. If I could just give you a few minutes to put on the record, what exactly are we talking about with coercive control?
When we explain this, the definition that we give is that coercive control is a pattern, a continuum of tactics and strategies, manifestations of violence and exploitation with the aim of terrorizing and dominating the victim, deprive them of their rights. As other witnesses said, there's a real intention behind this. It's often done in a gradual, sneaky way by a partner or an ex-partner, and it's repeated over time. So when you have a good grasp of coercive control and what it means, you're not going to mix it up with a protective conduct, because you see there's a difference in intention. So we're not saying that it's just like an argument with your spouse. No, it's something that takes place over time. It's a taking over control rather than losing control. It manifests in lots of different ways. You've referred to our tool here where we give various examples in the police mat. It's not restrictive. There's no limits on this. And sometimes when a perpetrator of violence wants to use one type of tactic, if it doesn't work anymore, if the victim wants to take back power, then they'll add in another tool from his particular toolbox and perhaps then use physical violence. For example, there can be a coercive control situation where there'll never be any violence because it won't be necessary, and often the victims will be experiencing coercive control without realizing it. So we've developed a tool where we've said it's not love, it's control. And victims have said, when I look at resources, when I look up domestic violence, I don't read that to be my situation. He's never been violent, he's never touched me, they say. But when we give them this tool that really stirs things up, and then when we go out to the media and when we talk about coercive control, we get calls coming in afterwards and people say, yes, that's exactly what I'm experiencing. I thought I was going mad. had. He said I was just exaggerating, that I had a problem with my mental health. He said to my family that I was very sensitive, but in fact I can see that he's actually weaving this web around me. But there was no physical violence. Sometimes there is, but when there's no physical violence, it's very hard for victims to be aware of this. So judicial actors need to be informed about this, and then they can be sentinels and inform victims about what's actually happening to them. Sometimes it's not a criminalised procedure. It can be via immigration or a family law step, or with notaries and lawyers. Everyone needs to be aware of this so that they can render something visible that's invisible for the victim. And we've created tools for various judicial actors so that they can put the right questions, so that in family law they're able to document when there's coercive control, to raise this with the judge, and with immigration they're able to see the specific ways in which the spouse is actually controlling their partner who has precarious status.
This has both talked about education as being very important. I wonder if I can go to you if there's any time, because what you're describing talks about intention and a pattern, which doesn't really bode well in terms of the judicial system, the criminal justice system. So if I could perhaps start with Professor Koshan to talk about, because I know you said criminalizing is probably not a good idea, but talk about the education component.
Sadly, Anita, your 5 minutes is up.
For BIPOC communities, why is the criminalization of coercive control more of an issue?
Sure. Thank you for that question. I think there's two main reasons that we've raised. The first is that if you look at the history of the criminal law, and if you look specifically at something like mandatory charging and domestic violence policies, you'll see that often violence and abuse is treated differently when faced by BIPOC communities. It might not be, it's not understood the same way by police officers, by members in the legal system, and often this leads to the victim being charged as an aggressor. Studies have shown that this happens at much higher rates with Indigenous and Black women, where they are identified and charged as a primary aggressor in a situation of domestic violence when they were really the survivors there. So that is a risk that we really think should be taken seriously with any new criminal offense. And the other one is that marginalized communities, racialized communities, disabled women, queer communities, all of these groups, they have valid and historical reasons to distrust the police and the legal system. And so relying on the legal system and the criminal justice system as the solution, in effect, it kind of it sort of places these people outside the system and outside an ability to seek help. It allows for certain communities to be able, people who feel more comfortable, I guess, going to the legal system and talking to police officers might feel like they can access this criminal law, but many of these communities would not want to seek out for this.
So what would you recommend as the alternative?
I think what we would recommend as the alternative is like I've said, funding for social services, funding for housing, and education. So I think having education for frontline providers, having education for social service workers, that toolbox that was being spoken about, I think that's a great idea, so that people are aware of coercive control. And so if this kind of, if these events are being seen, people will understand that this is abuse and someone might need help. I think social services and kind of housing and as you were saying, basic income, I think all of these should be prioritized.